So welcome to tonight, Hope in the Darkness. I want to talk about some things that are really gripping our world. And so tonight, in some ways, in the midst of hope and in darkness, we're going to talk a little bit about injustice. I remember when I was in high school, I invited one of my friends, Johnny, over to our house. This is before cell phones and GPS and all that kind of stuff. And Johnny had come he was 2 or 3 hours late. And then he finally showed up. And we were like, "Hey, Johnny, why didn't you come to our house?" And he said, "I was afraid to ask for directions." See, Johnny was black and I was white, and he was in the white section of town, and he was fearful for his life to stop, and there weren't cell phones. He was worried. And I didn't really get that until I went to visit him in his house, and then I felt a little bit of that. Some of you know that we've gone through the whole thing with the Botham Jean family and all the things that have been done in the midst of his life and trying to deal with that. And we wonder, is there any hope in the midst of this darkness? And some of you feel that right now with what we're going through. When I was a kid, it would have been real easy, I think, for me to be a racist in that my dad's really good friend was walking through East St. Louis. He was a teacher there at the community college, and a bunch of black men beat him up. And as they beat him up, they said, "We did this because you're white." And apparently later on, when some of them were caught, they thought he was a bill collector, and how that affected our family. And we had to make a choice. Is that just their actions, or are we going to be racist towards other people? I'll never forget when I was in college and I was there with a mission team, and I guess for whatever reason I got on the wrong street and ended up being on a Muslim street. And I was chased off the street with sticks and fists and all, because I was a Christian and I was on their street, and it would have been easy, and I still don't understand everything. And recently, being in the Middle East, I saw all kinds of racism in how people are treated. And so we live in a world that is broken, and we struggle with what does injustice look like and how do we deal with that. And I will tell you that in every culture I've been in, there's been injustice and racism and xenophobia and misunderstanding. And none of us are perfect. And in this broken world, we try to struggle to say, where do we come out of this? How do we deal with this? How do we overcome? Jesus even said at one point, the poor are always with you, but still you do your best to try to reach out to the poor. I guess since that very beginning, Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, as they're in the garden, God charges Adam and Eve with choose life. And when they chose life, things were great. But when they chose themselves, it was no longer life they were choosing. And from then on, our world has been in a sense of chaos and groaning. And from that point on, we get the death of Abel by Cain. Not racism, but still chaos and death. Jesus tells us that the evil one came to kill and to steal and to destroy. And he still does the same today. Romans chapter 8 says that creation groans, waiting for this time that it's going to be reunited. It's going to become a new creation. And while I don't want to be a pessimist and say things are never going to get better, there's no question that God understands that things are never going to be the way that they should. But it doesn't leave us to do nothing. In fact, in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus walks in the temples. And when he walks in the temple, he overthrows a few tables and he yells at him and says, "Hey, it shouldn't be this way." He didn't destroy people. He didn't steal. But he did overturn the tables and say, "Hey, there are people here that aren't being treated right. And we need to stand up and treat people the way that they need to be treated." He said, "You've made this place that's supposed to be a house of prayer into a den of robbers." And there's no question that some of the people there had different colors than Jesus in their skin. You see, God has always been upset about people that are marginalized. In fact, in James chapter 1, he says, true religion is if you take care of the widows and orphans, the people that can't stand up for themselves. That's what God constantly calls us to. I don't know what it's like to be black or brown or yellow or whatever color, dark and light. I only know what it's like to be in my skin. But I do know that God constantly calls me to make a difference in this world. It's amazing that God says to us that there's going to be every tribe and nation and tongue in heaven. Revelation chapter 7, professing the name, coming into heaven with who Jesus is. Galatians tells us that there's no longer any Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, but instead all of us are together with who Jesus is. You see, God does hear you. And God does hear me. In fact, Psalm chapter 34 says, God is close to the brokenhearted. In Psalm 147, he says, God heals those that are broken. I think maybe the question we need to ask tonight is, well, then who's my neighbor? Luke chapter 10 talked about that. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells a story. It's the person that's marginalized, the person that you don't think that values. And then when the lawyer comes and says, well, what is the greatest command? Matthew chapter 22, Jesus says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. It's how we love others that makes a difference in our world. I can't solve all the injustices. I can't solve the racism. I can't solve what's going on, but I can do this. I can love, I can stand up, and I can make a difference. Matthew chapter 25 says to the goats and to the sheep, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. A cup of cold water, visiting those in prison, taking care of those that can't take care of themselves. You see, we live in a powerful world, a dark world, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12. But Matthew says that you are the light of the world, Matthew chapter 5. He calls us to be different. In fact, John writes several times in chapter 8 and later on in chapter 14, he says, Jesus is the darkness in this, or Jesus is the light in this dark world, and he came to make a difference and to bring light into darkness. And so he constantly calls us to make a difference. In 1 John chapter 2, he writes and he tells us how that if we follow the ways of this world, things are going to end and not end well. But if we follow the will of God, then we'll live with him forever. And so God constantly charges us to say, you can overcome, you can be what he needs us to be. And then 1 John chapter 5 and verses 4 and 5 talks to us about the idea that God calls us to be who he wants us to be. So, here's the hope that you have. You love. God loves. That makes a difference. Don't be like the evil one to steal and to kill and destroy. But instead, be like what God calls you to be, is to choose life, to love, and to make a difference. There is hope in this dark world. We will not see it all. There will always be injustice until heaven. But we can make a difference, and there is hope, and God calls us to make that hope.